Joining us today, we have Gail Bradbrook, co-founder of Extinction Rebellion. We have Jess from XR Youth, and we have Millie from Bristol Youth Strike. And we're going to be having a bit of a natter, really, about everything: our economy, our environment, how they work, how their fates are intertwined, and our experiences as activists in amongst all of this. And of course, it's impossible to talk about any of this without talking about the global pandemic that we're all in the midst of. So I just wanted to start by asking Jess, Millie, Gail, how are you doing in amongst this crisis?
I think it's going quite well at the minute. It's sort of everything's moved online, and that was tough in the beginning, but we've sort of got used to it. I think being from the northeast, it is quite tough up here, as we're often an area that's sort of forgotten about, and it is very deprived. So I think a lot of people are struggling, but for me personally, things are okay at the minute.
And Millie, it must be a strange time to be in school.
I was meant to be doing my A-levels this year, and my school just ended on a random Wednesday in March, and that was my entire education done. And it felt really weird, and everything was up in the air for a while, but as Jess said, everything's moving online, and it's like kind of the normal for now is what it's turning into, and we're getting used to it, but I'm also okay.
And Gail, how are you?
I'm great, actually. I think this crisis, like the 2008 crisis, and obviously this is on a different scale, is going to impact people very differently. I mean, I've personally had to apply for benefits this week, but I still sit with that it's not a massive pressure. I was queuing outside Tesco the other day and talking to this guy whose business has just totally collapsed, and because he's got some savings, he's suddenly expected to spend all that. It just impacts people differently. And of course, there are people dying. So, if I'm going to say anything about my own personal thing, it's in that context, really. I'm personally enjoying the pause, the settling. The nature in Stroud just sounds amazing at the minute. I've got a lockdown lover. My boyfriend came up from London. That's been really nice. And I share my children with their dad, so we haven't quite driven each other mad yet. And I love the fact that everything that was supposed to be impossible, or not everything, but many things that are supposed to be impossible are now happening. Yeah,
I love the way that Sarah put it in the talk on Monday. It's not just a magic money tree that's been found; it's a magic money forest. And I guess it'd be great to get your sense, Gail, of what really stands out for you as something that's changed in the wake of coronavirus as to how it relates to the climate and ecological emergency.
I mean, the first thing is that coronavirus is an ecological crisis. Viruses come from biodiversity loss and from how we treat animals in industrial animal agriculture and as a part of sort of food chain. So this is not a separate crisis. This is part of the ecological crisis. There's plenty of written about that. And also, as XR came out of a group called Rising Up, and we always talked about how there were many crises around. There's the financial crisis that could happen at any time. Well, hey, we're in one. There's health crises. There's a possibility, again, which would be related to animal agriculture, of an antibiotics crisis any minute when antibiotics suddenly fail us. And both my son and myself had to take them recently. Imagine a world where they stop working. We're getting the warnings about these things. So we're in a system that is both unable to think about the fact that it's creating crises and then unable to respond appropriately. I mean, in some countries have responded better than others. There was a really good article in the Sunday Times, actually, from Jonathan Leake and others about this particular crisis and how badly it's been handled by the government. It's interesting to see that coming out of the Times. Our own Dr. Rupert Reed put out a message a couple of weeks ago to say that the letter you're about to get from the government, it included something like a line of saying we did all we could, is a lie, essentially, because they delayed responding. And it tells us a lot about how safe we are in reality and that we've entered a time of crises. This is not going to be something that's over at some point, in the sense of I can't predict that, actually, but a really good person to listen to is Daniel Schmattenberger online, about the systemic issues this throws up. But the point is that viruses mutate. It can take a long time to find a vaccine, and vaccines don't always work for but so and so on. It's not a simple situation that we find ourselves in that's sort of done with and then it's over. And then the impact on the economy is huge. We interviewed Paul Mason and Molly Scott Cato and Anne Pettifor a couple of weekends ago, and the way Paul Mason said it, which is the way I was thinking about it, was slightly amateurish economist that I am, was that with the financial crisis, it was like the roof falling in. The whole kind of speculative economy, offshored casino capitalism, as they like to call it, or these exotic products that were all blowing up here in this weird ether, caused a financial crisis. This is different. The foundations of the economy are being pulled out right now. And because we're not set up to deal with crises, the things the magic money tree is paying for, which does include some support to individuals, there's going to be so many gaps in it, and there are people falling through those gaps, and I think something like the economy is having over a 30% reduction in outputs this month. It's just unprecedented. I can't see anything happening from my own understanding other than a depression coming. So anyway, it was rather a long answer, but it's a really interesting times.
This seems to be the running theme, of the last year, and certainly something that looks like it's going to carry on into the decades ahead is interrelated crises coming closer and closer into contact. And I'm amazed and astounded by the drive and the knowledge and the wisdom of the youth activists that are coming up in the last sort of year or two, and even before. So I'd be really interested to hear from you, Jess.
I've sort of learned from this crisis that the way in which we are governed is sort of all wrong, and sort of money does talk, and we constantly in our society put profit over life, and I think that it was very evident by sort of the government's approach to coronavirus in the beginning, and it was only when things started getting really, really serious and people started putting that pressure there that they just sort of decided to take more action. So I think it's sort of reflective of the climate crisis as well, how we will just continue to take until it gets to that point where we no longer can do that.
I would love to take a little step back and give you, Jess and Millie, the floor. You've got Gail here, co-founder of Extinction Rebellion, has been thinking about these things for a long time, been thinking about the economy for a long time. What sort of, you're here now, what questions would you have for Gail? For
me, it would sort of be, what approach should we be taking sort of when this crisis subsides, for those who have been gravely affected by the crisis and sort of their focus is no longer the climate anymore and might be sort of housing and things. How do we sort of tap into those people and get them back on board with our movement?
My colleague Joel was saying it like this, you have people who are dealing with end of the month issues, can they pay the bills? And then we've got this end of the world issues. And actually the root causes of both of those issues are the same. They're what you could call systemic issues in our democracy and in our economy. And it's how we talk to both of those issues. I've been working on a project for some time. It's had different names, but it's currently called Money Rebellion, looking at money strikes. And we're talking in the language, I guess, of a need for a reset. This is when you start thinking about economics and how it's impacting individuals immediately each month, and suddenly these people that were on minimum wage and 0-hour contracts are being clapped and called our key workers, and I'm glad they're being honoured, but are we going to start, also being put at risk? How are we going to shape the economy so that we put people's well-being first, and so that we minimise the harm that we do to the world? In economics, we tend to measure a few things like GDP growth and productivity, and it puts all the emphasis on the wrong thing. I mean, in most accountancy systems, you measure positives and negatives, but if you have an oil spill in the world, it puts up GDP growth. You don't measure what impact it's had on people. What I'm really trying to say is that we need to rewire our system and make demands to that effect. And so I'm in a process now with lots of others of asking for input on a money rebellion. It needs to be more movement of movements and work with other organisations, and that's the conversation that we're having. And actually, Millie, you know, with the school strikes, I meant to ask you this earlier actually, so I'm sorry putting you on the spot here, but I wonder, like, the tactics of school strikers going forwards.
We've actually been discussing that quite a lot recently, because when Greta came to Bristol, it was the worry around the pandemic was starting to go up quite a lot, and we had a couple of people saying, like, is it safe to have such a big gathering of people? But at that time we weren't aware of the magnitude of the situation. And now currently, obviously, we haven't been able to strike, and there are a couple of groups are doing digital strikes, and people join and you get quite a big number of people, but some don't see the point of doing that when it's not actually a school strike, which is understandable. So I think as the Bristol group, we've been discussing ways and like we can get involved in other campaigns during this time. So there's the College Green, where we had our strike after Greta came. It got completely covered in mud, and obviously grass grows back, and the grass wasn't actually destroyed. But we have been involved in the rewilding project on College Green. So that's about like they've got loads and loads of ideas. So working with the council, and yeah, there's a couple. We haven't probably looked into it, but we're just thinking about getting involved in small campaigns, and I know other groups are probably doing that as well. I know, Jess, you do the Teesside school strike, so I don't know if that's similar to what you guys are doing, or...
Yeah, we're just sort of trying to integrate with the community at the minute. So our strike runs alongside XR, and it's usually the same people that attend both. So we're sort of trying to work to support those key workers that we have that do attend, and see if there's anything that they need at the minute.
There is this like massive, you can't really get your head around it, intergenerational injustice that's going on a number of fronts. And I don't know how to say this in a way that's not like really depressing, so I'm not going to go on about it, but leaving your generation literally, as I say it, to stock up the stuff in the atmosphere, you know, the carbon emissions in the atmosphere, leaving you with unfeasible amounts of debts that you're somehow supposed to pay off, toxins across it, and so on. You know what I'm saying? Like unlikely to get stable jobs, no pensions, hard to get on the so-called housing ladder. I mean, it's shockingly disgusting what people are doing to the next generation, and I guess for so many rebels like myself, it's kind of not on our watch. You know, we are doing what we can, and when it comes down to it, there's an economic system that asks us to comply, and we have a collective power to not comply with that system. And the way we can not comply with it will vary according to individual circumstances. You've got utility companies that have been privatised, that have to make profits, that aren't tending to our needs properly. You've got the government that is not taxing wealthy people and corporations in the way they should be, and then is spending vast amounts of money on ridiculous projects like HS2 and Trident, and obviously that's personal opinion, but XR Peace would support me on that one, I'm sure. You've got the UK government and its crown dependencies, overseas territories, the City of London, being the number one supplier of corruption services across the world. What that means, you can look it up on the Financial Secrecy Index from Tax Justice Network, which means that the UK helps people to hide their money. We are like the number one at doing that. So there is all this money, it's being hidden, and it's being hidden by institutions, accountancy firms, legal firms, banks have wealth management programs, all this stuff. The money's there, we could sort this out, we could do things differently. And so we're expected to pay into this economy as it is, to pay our utility bills, to pay our taxes, pay our council taxes, pay, you know, quite a lot of these things you can't not pay. It's quite hard if you're on PAYE. We're expected to pay off debts. It's completely possible, folks, to say we've had enough, you know, and lots of the adults, older people in your lives would have had an education system that was free and they weren't saddled with debts and all the rest of it. So students refuse to pay rents, for students to refuse to pay loans back, or to say they'll never earn enough money to pay those loans back. There's lots of possibilities. And I guess that's why I'm wondering, as youth strikers move from school into that, you know, phase of life, like what else is to come? Why would any of us comply with an economic system that's killing life on earth? And I think that's the big question for us going forwards, is what can we do differently? There's a thing called conditional commitment, where you say you'll do something if other people will join you. So you don't just immediately have to go, I'm not paying my debts off. It would be a question of, there'd be a reason, there'd be demands, and you'd do it as a collective, and we could get together and say, yeah, we'll do this if other people join us. You might get a collective of people say, yeah, I'm interested in doing something with Money Rebellion. I happen to be a Barclays Bank mortgage holder, or happen to be a student with a loan or whatever, and find out what numbers we've got and what people are willing to do. And that's where our power lies. The power always lies in the collective, and it's our willing to take things on. And of course, there are legal risks and the risk to credit ratings, but there's a lot less risk if we do it together. This
concept of debt is something that really, really comes up time and time and time again in the wake of coronavirus, especially now. And it's something that is so poorly understood, myself included, but something that young people, you know, increasingly are facing being burdened with for the rest of their lives. So I was wondering, Millie, what does debt mean to you?
It's such a huge topic that it does really worry me, and it does feel like it's something that holds us back quite a lot. That's probably what baffles me the most, is what happened, how did we get here?
There's a history of the current economic system, and it depends where you want to go back to. I mean, one way to go back a long, long way would be to say that people lived in an animistic way in relationship with the earth, in gratitude. So when you're talking about debt of gratitude, in a sense of being part of the web of life and knowing that there was something before them and something after them, and in an honouring relationship with the earth. And there's a modern version of that story. Charles Eisenstein talks about New Story of the People, to come back. And at some point we took on a story of domination of nature, that we're here to control and we can do what we want. And some people think that came from a patriarchal wound, of a moment of scarcity and fear. I'm not really sure, but it's a particular story that we can dominate. So that's kind of going back to the kind of story of it. I mean, just in terms of this sort of current economic system, it is a form of, it's called neoliberalism. It's a form of like capitalism on crack cocaine in a way. And it's very, very corrupted actually. And it's very promoting of monopolies. So lots of people, so some companies having a lot of power. So some people who are into capitalism would say this is not functioning and useful. And just to give you some like things about, you know, how it's actually working. So then it becomes very corrupted, and then people have money, and then success breeds success. It's a sort of piece of systems thinking. Actually, once you've got money, you can get more money. So the fossil fuel industry gets subsidized if you include how much it's allowed to pollute as well, according to, I think it's the IMF, $10 trillion a minute. $10 trillion a minute to the fossil fuel industries. That's how little money there is around. You know, can you imagine that? And then the amount of money that's hidden in what they call tax havens, or the other word for them is secrecy jurisdiction, is of order 32 trillion. And if you put a dollar bill down on the ground and stack it up, it would get to the moon and back 4 times. That's how little money there is. You know, there is money. The money exists. So how we got here, I mean, that story's told by Naomi Klein in The Shock Doctrine. It's told in Treasure Islands by Nick Shaxson. If you want I'm a bit of a nerd, I read books and stuff like that. I've also got about economics, street school economics, with some of that in. But essentially, some people decided that it was called the Chicago School of Economics. They met up in Montpellier in Switzerland, and they planned essentially a financial revolution, and they were outliers for a while, and they got to the centre. And one of the reasons they got to centre, in my opinion, is because it's very beneficial for a few people. It makes some people incredibly wealthy. There are something like 8 people who own the same amount of money as the 50% poorest people in the world. 8 people. It just doesn't make sense. You know, you don't have to be like a screaming anarchist socialist to think that doesn't really work. And I think one of the key challenges for us in telling a news story is not to get ideological and start talking in the language of being anti this and pro that. It's just like, what is it that we want and what is it that we don't want? It's not a kind of ideological battleground. I think somebody was putting in the chat channel, you know, there were loads of other things that we can do with economics. You can, you know, as Ha-Joon Chang said, he's an economist from Cambridge, tell me what kind of economy you want, and I'll design it for you. You know, Mrs. Thatcher said there is no alternative. It was called Tina, and there just totally are. You've got donut economics from Kate Raworth. You've got regenerative capitalism from John Fullerton. You've got post-capitalism from what's his face, Paul Mason. Bioregional economics. There's loads of cool ideas. You know, you can measure prosperity without growth. That's Tim Jackson's patch. Like, there's some great ideas. There's no lack of ideas and there's no lack of money. And so how do you get the change? That's the point. Well, we know how we do it. You have to rebel, folks.
Interesting you say that, because Todd's got a question on Zoom that speaks exactly to this. He says, given that we can't protest right now and the country is already in a state of fear and mourning, could this be an opportunity for XR to evolve and start working on some of the solutions? But I mean, you've already spoken a little bit about Money Strike. And what, you know, how else do you see XR's role in terms of sort of actually moving towards a post-COVID world that works for everyone?
Well, I think the first thing to say is just like, let's be truthful about XR's economic situation. You know, XR UK's run out of money, and that's been a painful thing in the last few weeks. And there are different ways that we can organise our systems and processes and learn from how we've tried to decentralise and what's gone well and what hasn't gone well. So I think there's a really important piece, and it's in our strategy to look at our inner strength and how we organise. And I asked Frederick Laloux about this, because he wrote this book called Reinventing Organisations about how to do decentralisation. And he was saying, look, you guys are the leading edge, and I can tell you what, there's some real messes and things that don't work and things that we've learned from that. So we really need some energy and attention on our own inner work here, our own inner economics. There's like really, I don't really understand it, but there's really cool ideas out there. I think there's something called DAO Stack, where you have this kind of blockchain technology where you can help to get them share the resources fairly amongst a decentralized network. It'd be great to try some things like that if there's people got energy to bring that in. So there's that piece about, you know, what's our vision, sharing the vision of that there are alternatives to economics without having to say we're definitely for this thing and definitely against that thing. But I would say it's not the time to say that we can't protest. We can absolutely protest, and it's not as visually impactful as a grandma being carried off the Waterloo Bridge by a police officer to, you know, get online and go, no bailouts for business as usual, bailouts for people and planet. But I think that message is already out there. It's in the psyche. You know, people are saying, why should we bail out Richard Branson? His company's called Virgin because it was based in the British Virgin Islands, a tax haven. He's a tax dodger. It's well known. Why are we bailing people out like that? So I think that's our power. I don't mean to shame him particularly, but there is something a bit off there, right, folks? Let's think about what economic power we do have. We're all paying bills. You know, these water companies, quite a lot of them are offshore. Quite a lot of them are not fixing the leaks they should be, not planning for crises. There's lots that we could play with here.
So I'd like to bring Jess in here, because this concept of power is really important and interesting. How empowered do you feel at this moment in time to influence both the climate and ecological emergency, but also the economic system that you inhabit?
So I think sort of at the minute, within sort of this pandemic, it's quite sort of empowering in a way, because communities are coming together and we're sort of seeing this for the first time ever. And it's proven that we can come together and we can change things and people can rely on each other. But I think it also shows as well that we have got a huge battle on our hands, because obviously to solve the climate and ecological crisis, we've got to first sort of change the economic system and things as well. And I think for me, it sort of shows how debt in the economic system that we live in is a very man-made concept, and sort of it's rooted in power and individual power. But if we all embraced our collective power, then we can change that and we can take back the power that is ours.
And what question would you have burning on your mind in terms of how the economy works and how it relates to the natural world?
How do we move to a point where we use any economic system for good? So obviously we see how individuals of power are running the current system. How do we move towards a point where the collective run that system?
There are people that have spent like their academic lives thinking about this. There's an organisation, for example, called the New Economics Foundation, who wrote a document about how you transition an economy. There's I haven't read this properly all yet, but there's this Project Drawdown, which it's got many contributors about how we can do things differently. Now, I remember Molly Scott Cato, who's Professor of Green Economics, saying the problem is it's like trying to change, probably a bad analogy, but I think she was saying something like an aeroplane into a helicopter mid-flight. You know, it's really tricky. But what we've got right now with the impacts on the economy of COVID is that the aeroplane literally had to go to ground. So we've got a chance to rebuild something. There's a bit of economics is called Keynesian economics. I think I'm just showing off. Stop it, Gail. It is. I'm not really an economist, so I'm just like trying to pretend I am today. But they do what they call fiscal stimulus. You know, it's like basically means spending money into the economy to try and get it going again. And what are they going to spend that money on? Is it going to be like HS2 or bailing out companies, or is it going to be basically a Green New Deal? That like there have been Green New Deals tabled in Parliament by Caroline Lucas and Clive Lewis and others. You've got AOC's Green New Deal for the states, and again, you know, there may be things in that not everybody agrees with, but they're ready to go. It's not. We don't have to work it out. They try and set the environmental movement up against working class people, I think. Try and say, oh, like, you know, you want us all back in caves, and B, you know, you just don't care about the economy. Well, first of all, like there's a McKinsey report, and you've got the economists from the Deutsche Bank going, on the one hand, the environmentalists get the way and this civilization's finished, or it carries on as it is and this civilization's finished. So, you know, the folks are saying we're finished. And then these Green New Deals are about jobs. And I think that we've got to think about changes that work. The way I call it is the lorry driver test. Is it going to work for my mate Dave, who's a lorry driver? So another example of what can be done is what's called carbon dividends, where you put a high price on carbon, but you immediately give money to everybody off the back of that. So if you live a high carbon lifestyle, the costs are going to go up. And I think just things like that need testing against the lorry driver. You know, what do we do to make sure that people are protected? And the whole point of Green New Deals is that it's, you know, there's very few jobs when you offshore money and you have these major infrastructure projects that are run by offshore companies and all the rest of it, versus, you know, doing work on people's houses to make sure they're insulated and they've got the right boiler and all that sort of stuff.
Millie, I saw you had your finger up a little while ago. Is there anything you wanted to bring in?
I was just building off what Jess was saying earlier, and I was just going to ask Gail, why do you think that we haven't seen evidence of governments and communities coming together like they have for the pandemic when it comes to climate change?
I wonder how much governments and communities have come together. I've definitely seen communities coming together. You know, I don't know who started that piece on a Thursday about clapping for our carers and NHS frontline workers. I know the government jumped in and adopted it. Did you see some of the pictures that went round of that on the press? It was all of white people. Like, the NHS and caring systems run not entirely, but by loads of people of color, racially marginalised people. You know, it's just same old narrative, isn't it? It's like, anyway. So, but basically, they just had literally no choice but to tackle this pandemic. Either they ignored it and it got worse, or they had to do what they had to do and it's impacted the economy. They literally had no choice. And in reality, they have no choice on the ecological crisis, but they're acting like they do. And I can't think it's anything other than that, you know, the same hubris, the same arrogance really, that thought somehow we were going to get away with, you know, doing COVID differently at the start, and what's meant that a lot more people are going to die as a result. That's the same kind of arrogance that thinks we can go to 4 degrees of warming, which is the pathway that we're heading on at the minute, and be okay. I think it's a collective delusion or something. And it's people who have just deep vested interests in the current system and don't want to face the fact that something has to change.
Sort of on the side of social justice things, just talking there about sort of people who are marginalised. How do we sort of seek to diversify XR as we move forward and sort of break down those barriers and reach out to those sort of communities?
You know, focusing on these end of the month problems as well as end of the world problems at the same time, and putting the links between those two is part of that piece. I think also generally as social movements not to make assumptions about who's already here, and you know, when there's some discussions about diversity and we're all called middle class people, I know, like, you know, my dad was a coal miner, and quite a lot of the people that founded this movement are working class people as it happens, and it's quite a lot of working class people end up being made to be invisible if you're educated. I think that there's a really incredible piece of work being done right now, led by Skeena Rathor, who's part of the Guardians and Vision team and Vision Tenting team, to look at what I'm going to use some language, systemic agreements we need within XR that make changes. So we're often very good at systemic analysis of like oppressions and how things get in the way of diversity and keep us separated. It's not always clear what it is that we need to do to make things change that aren't then seen as individuals' problems. You know, there are agreements that we could make around how we want to manage spokespeople, for example, or how we want to think about power and accountability. So it's a big shift that's needed. I don't think anybody's really cracked that piece, and I'm really looking forward to Skeena's lead on that.
So I was going to ask, one main worry when introducing new policies is to tackle the climate crisis is that the solutions will drive more people into poverty and create more socio-economic costs than benefits. To what extent do you think that that's true?
It could be a risk, and that's, you know, certainly that's the mistake, as far as I understand it, they made in France when they brought in tax rises on fuel, I think, and you got the Gilets jaunes movement out of the back of that. You know, what happened there, as far as I understand, I had explained by a couple of French people, was that the environmental movement worked together with the Gilets jaunes and they formed something called Gilets citoyens, and they demanded the citizens' assembly that's happening in France at the minute. It's gone digital, apparently it's going well, and it's focused on ordinary people understanding the crisis and coming up with solutions. And it's legally binding in France, which is really important. So we need to keep pushing for citizens' assemblies so that ordinary people get a say, because I don't think you can make anything perfect. You know, you can't say, oh, nobody's going to be impacted. So how do we manage those impacts, and how do we make agreements and have a demographically representative group of people coming up with the policy solutions? That's why we've always said it's not up to XR to go around telling everybody what the policy changes should be, but for other people to be involved in looking at that and the impacts of that. Yeah, I think that's why you have to look at social impacts as well as environmental impacts in the round. You know, so for example, if you internalize the cost, so it's an economic term, it means, you know, let's say lots of us are eating beef burgers on a regular basis and they're apparently quite cheap. Well, it's because the cost of those burgers have been externalized onto the suffering of the animals, onto the environment, lots of different ways. If you bring all those costs into the burger and they go up £10, you know, becomes £10 a burger for some people who that's how they eat, there's going to be an impact, isn't there? So it's like, how do we kind of help manage that shift and help support that transition? And it's totally feasible. I mean, there's alternative to beef burgers. Obviously, I'm using a bit of a naff example. Get very excited about Greg's vegan sausage rolls myself because my kids will eat them.
I have a question for Jess, if she wants to answer it. It's about there's like a quite a big debate among and I know I've been asked it quite a couple of times as a young person, young activist, is that there's this belief that allowing climate change to happen and mitigating its effects will be cheaper than actually tackling the root cause of the problem. So in your opinion, which is a more beneficial approach, do you think, tackling the root cause or mitigating the response?
I personally think that first we should sort of tackle the root of the problem. So I think for me, it's sort of cutting those emissions and sort of starting there, and then we peel back all the different layers and get down to the system. I would like to see all of it change right now, but I recognise that we sort of need to do it in a structured way.
Can I also respond?
Yeah, I was about to ask you.
When people say let it happen, you know, Jonas Rockström, who's a professor at Potsdam Institute, said that if we, in his estimation, if we get to 4 degrees of warming, half the world will die. You know, like how is that okay? Like how can anybody say that's I mean, to me that's fascism. I don't know how else to say it really, that says, well, let's just let it happen. And of course it's the most vulnerable people who had the least contribution to this situation, which will be on the front line of that. It just, and I don't believe that if we go that route anyway, that it's going to work out for us, because I don't see how we can adapt. I don't see our civilization's going to survive that much trauma. Wars happening, fighting over scarce resources. It's just, that's the sort of mentality of domination, I think, that comes from that. And I suppose the other thing is that, you know, with the tipping points in climate science, there is a geological record here where there's been 5 mass extinction events in the past, and the Permian mass extinction event, when the planet heated up severely and there's some correlation between what's happening now and then, was 97% of all life dying. Really? You know, we have to remember what we're for as well as what we want to stop. And I love nature, and by that I mean people as well. You know, what we want to fight for a livable planet where we're all together. Maybe it's possible that there's a few 100,000 human beings living in bunkers surrounded by chicken and pig shit and vats of amoeba creating oxygen. I don't want to live on that planet, frankly. Do you know what I mean? So let's be like what we're for, and it's for beauty and for life.
That was beautiful, Gail. Thank you. So I think we're coming towards the end. I'd like to for us to all look towards the future. There's quite a few questions coming in on Zoom and social media, looking at exactly this. How can we ensure the good things carry on later? How do we stop the government bailing these crooks out? How do we get people to stop buying things they don't need? How can we finance more renewables in the next couple of months? So there's so many questions out there about the future and how we move towards a new story. So I'd welcome thoughts from any of you about that. Nature
does it herself if you let her get on with it. I don't know if anybody's come across Isabel Tree's book on rewilding Neb Farm. They basically let, I think, something like 3,500 acres. I think it's in the southeast. I might be getting some details wrong, but in the southeast of England, go back to nature, introduce some species, but it's also still farmed, and it's got all these rare species. It's incredible how quickly this place has bounced back. And I think the hope lies in nature herself's ability to reclaim spaces. I'm loving all the grass that's getting longer, and the so-called weeds taking over the crevices in the pavement and all the rest of it, right? And then there's the energy, and I'm slightly cringing for what I want to say, and I hope it's not patronising, Jess and Millie, but there's energy in young people to build something new. I mean, in some respects, as much as I'm a rebel, find it tedious rebelling. Like, come on, we need to be building the new ways. And again, when we all know we've got each other's backs, we're together, we're not fighting with each other. 0.3% of the population owns 69% of the land in the UK. Why don't we just go and dig it up and start planting our spuds? And, you know, permaculture rebellion, somebody said to me online. I think that's a fantastic idea. So we're going to say to young people, you've got nowhere to live unless you pay exorbitant rents, no way of self-sustaining. Go and say, well, you know, oh, this land's owned by the Duke of whatever. Sorry, Duke, but we're like having it back because you nicked it off us in the enclosures. You know, look at your history of resistance. And then, like, go and live on it. See what happens. There's all sorts of cool stuff you guys could get up to. Enjoy it, you know. Dream big and be really peacefully mischievous.
And so, Jess, what when you look into the future, what do you dream?
I sort of hope that we can move towards a point where we no longer take from the planet, but we no longer sort of take from each other as well, and sort of where we do embrace that regenerative culture and everyone's accepted and sort of every way of life is accepted as long as it's not harmful. Just a world where money doesn't talk. That's what I hope for.
And how about you, Millie?
What Jess said was lovely. It's kind of similar to what I think as well. Yeah, I want to, for the future, I hope that we can work together and we can see less anger and more, sound a bit cringe, but more love for each other and the planet, because we can't keep living like this where we seem to have no care for things around us. We need to change mindsets. So my hope for the future is that everyone's mindsets change and we realise that this is our world. We need to stop destroying it.
There's all this talk about the future and where we're at and where we're headed. I think a lot of people feel almost fear and trepidation at sort of getting on this train because it is really daunting. So I was wondering if, to sort of close off, if Jess, Millie, you could talk about how you got to where you are today. You know, how did you get to this, from this, you know, position of not knowing to maybe still not knowing? I don't know. I'm not sure anyone does. But getting on that journey of working towards something new.
I'd say I got here and I got to this position because I felt scared, even though some of it is ease, and I do still feel like there are like-minded people and maybe we are working towards something, but we're not seeing loads of change. I'd say, yeah, I got to this point because I was feeling helpless, so I found a way in.
I did a lot of activism for a few years around sort of animal rights and things, and through that we did a lot of sort of research and things into the effects of agriculture on the environment, but then I also sort of started realising myself that it was a lot bigger than just that, and that this is a whole problem with how we're governed and how the world works. So I sort of joined XR in January of last year, and from then, with help from a few people there, we set up the youth strike in Teesside, and it's all just sort of grew from there. And yeah, I sort of agree with what Millie's saying, that within schools we're never really taught about it. I mean, I remember being sat in a classroom when I was around 7 and being told that I'll never have to worry about the end of the world, because that's not going to happen for another 5 billion years when the sun swells and engulfs the earth whole. And I remember thinking, God, I'll never be around to see that. And now, only a few years later, sort of sat here battling with the end of the world.
Yeah, I remember those days. I feel like a very long time ago. And what about you, Gail? You know, how did this journey start for you?
Started when I was a really young woman. I think when my brain kicked in around age 9, and I was conscious of animal rights around then, and I was part of the Green Party when I was about 14. So, you know, and there's always more to learn, and we're all on a journey, aren't we? We're on a journey as individuals and collectively. And I think like a really significant shift for me has been from the women's movement. And I think, given the 3 women who've been in conversation today, that I wanted to say something about the rising feminine as it's spoken about, or you know, sisterhood, and also honouring anybody with female bodies and the gender differences that are out there as I speak to that. But you know, I heard for some of the earlier feminists that it was really painful being in women's groups, that you leave crying and stuff like that. And I get to sit in a circle with other female bodies women once a month with a full moon. I'm come from that kind of hippie community, but it just to be able to speak. And of course, the space is for the masculine, for men. I just want to speak to the sisterhood for now, but to be in places where you can really talk deeply and be held is just really important. To make those spaces, they're really, really precious spaces. And you don't have to give each other advice or anything like that. It's just to hear. We talk to a fire, actually, and we call to Grandmother Moon. And I think the other bit for me is that it's supposed to be fun. And this is like a really strong message I got in the ceremony for the solstice, was like, celebrate life. Like, sometimes it's hard work what we're doing, and sometimes we need to grieve and we need to despair and we're fearful and all the rest of it. But if it's wall to wall that, it's not fun. So if it stops being fun, like, think about what else needs to happen and whether you need a bit of a rest or look after yourself. Do you know what I mean? It's just like, that's the way we'll defeat fascism, is that we're the fun people. And we don't have to do wall-to-wall misery. Even in the most difficult times, we get to enjoy ourselves. That's what I really sort of feel this in an instinctive, beautiful level, that life wants to be lived through us, and that we're supposed to, it wants us to enjoy it, you know, not to feel like we're in a battle.
Thank you, Gail. That sounds like a really beautiful place to leave it. Thank you, Jess, Millie and Gail, for that wonderful conversation. And hopefully we will see you soon.